Yes.
Success.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh my God. It's
Nice
been
to
a
see you.
long time.
It has.
How are
Too
you?
long.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. All's well. All things my hair is getting a little long, but it's okay.
How's everything?
Yeah. I can't complain, I guess, too much, you know. I have work, which is good, which many photographers do not, so I'm lucky on that degree. The weather's been amazing, so not too much to get annoyed about, but I guess it feels like Groundhog Day every day. That's the only concern. Hey,
So what have you been doing lately in like in during the like the Corona time? What have you been doing? How have you been passing all these days?
yeah, well, I don't know if you know this, but I started teaching at the Royal Academy of Arts here in the Netherlands, in The Hague.
Oh, great.
Yeah, about 4 years ago. So we launched a new master's program 2 years ago. So I'm leading that basically. So right now it's a lot of, let's call it, I feel like a fireman. I'm putting out a lot of fires right now. So uh, also maybe expanding my skills of photography into therapy and such. So trying to ensure that the students feel okay and are able to make their work and do their work. So most of my day is basically spent behind a computer screen on Teams or Zoom or Jitsi or whatever. Talking, looking at work. We're getting close to our examination.
Okay.
And then, of course, I also just started my PhD about a year and a half ago. So, hey, landed Noorderman. Yeah, I just started my PhD about a year and a half ago. So between those two things, not much else. I sit on my balcony and look at the sky. That's about it.
Oh, that's the best, I think.
Like now, it's a little dark, but yeah, exactly.
So how did you discover you're into photography? Like, since you're originally an architect, as
Yep.
I know. So what's the story behind this change, like from architecture to like photography, like really special projects that we will talk about during the live. So how did
Hmm.
this happen and why photography?
Yeah, wow, geez, that might just take an hour in of itself. But so
Like,
uh, I'll try to keep it brief. I'll try to keep it brief. But basically, well, yeah, I mean, it's something I always wanted to do as a kid. Well, let's back up a little bit because I think it's sort of important for me. But so I was born in 1973, and I always like to start with that year because to me it's sort of an important year because it means 10 years later in 1983 or so, I would have been about 10 years old. And at
okay.
that time, it was sort of the, let's say, the resurgence of the Cold War. It was very sort of a hot Cold War. There was all kinds of tension between the Soviets and the Allies and NATO, etc. And that was being played out in the news, so on television and news magazines. So I guess I'm a child of the television revolution to some degree. So watching all of these events unfold on the screen, on the page, I finally clued in, maybe when I was 12 or 13, that well, somebody has to take those images, and that looks like a pretty cool job. So maybe I could do that. So that was kind of the first impetus, but also I guess I was always curious as a child, and I was always fascinated by that part of the world. But also, I think it was, I see people like joining. This is kind of cool. But yeah, that notion that I don't want to maybe, well, it might sound a little bit cliche, but this notion of, say, witness, that things are unfolding and that you as a photographer sort of become a participant in that, to me was quite exciting to my very juvenile brain. But eventually I got sidetracked in high school. basically. I went to an art high school, like a special school just for art and such. Oh, it was there where a photography teacher told me that I'm probably not going to make it as a photographer. I'm not very good at it. So why don't you find something else? So my fallback was architecture. So that's the kind of long, burnt story. Yeah.
Okay. And then you worked
Yeah.
in as an architecture for some time, right?
Yeah, I worked 5 years. So I graduated art school in 1996, and in 2001 is when I finally made the move to decide to become a photographer. It was also kind of an accident how it came back to be. I was actually planning on going to Africa again. I had made a trans-African journey by truck in 1997 with a couple of friends of mine, and I thought, I got to do this again, but I'm going to do it on my motorcycle. So I had this great idea, planning, and I was in Toronto, my hometown. 3 weeks before I was about to ship my motorcycle out, I got hit by a car on my bike. Yeah, on my bike, and I was, sliding along the pavement. I was looking at the truck and my crumpled bike, my crumpled dreams, smoldering and in smoke. But that's when I also said, well, I guess I'm going to be a photographer. So that was March of 2001. And within a couple of days, I had quit my job and, started just making photographs. And then in that summer of 2001 as well, I got an internship at a tabloid in Toronto. So that's where it all began.
And like you picked one of the hardest spots, I think, ever to photograph, like this area of Ukraine, and like you did a lot of work there where it's not visible for everyone, as you said. Like you see the revolution on the TV, but you don't get intimate stories from inside. So, and this is a totally different culture from yours, I believe. So how, like working on intense, intimate stories like this out of your hometown with a totally different culture, like how do you start? How do you plan for a project like a lot of them? But let's talk generally and then go deeper.
Okay. Well, it did take me a few years to finally make it to Ukraine. So I first started off in newspapers. So I was a freelance photographer for 4 or so years, working for newspapers, mostly in Canada. But then I did had lots of international clients, so New York Times, Newsweek, Stern Magazine, and such. And that was sort of my training, because I never really I didn't really have a photography education. So I was sort of in that, trying to learn and figure it out. And I'm kind of glad that I didn't necessarily run off, because I wasn't sure even what a camera was or how it really functioned. I wasn't necessarily comfortable with it. So it took me a few years to sort of become comfortable, but also just going in for simple assignments as, I don't know, like the hot new restaurant in town, go make a picture of that. So you're always having to negotiate some kind of relationship, basically, and confronting and challenging and trying to, on the one hand, develop that encounter, and on the same hand you have to sort of produce something an aesthetic, of course. So it took me a number of years to figure that out, and I knew when I was ready, and that was actually in 2004 when I went to Turkey. So that was my very first, no, 2003. I'm losing track. It's almost 15 years ago.
You had it in mind, like your aim was going to Ukraine, doing stories, but you wanted to prepare first in order to be there. That's
I would say maybe not necessarily an aim, but I knew that I didn't want to be doing daily journalism every day. So being a newspaper photographer to me was a fantastic job, but after the third or fourth year in a row where you photograph the Santa Claus parade, it gets a little tedious. And the guys and girls who manage to make that work are incredible at it, but it also needs a certain type of sensibility. I was a terrible news photographer. I was a terrible journalist in the sense that I wasn't really understanding, say, the immediacy of the news, but I was very good at sort of understanding the context of something that's happening. So
Yeah.
I knew that I wanted to make some kind of bigger work, whatever that means, or longer form work. I just didn't necessarily have the skills. And then the thing with Ukraine was, as I said, like the reason I bring up 1983 and the Cold War and such is because that was so seared into my brain. 1983, 1985 with Able Archer, or 86, and then the meltdown of Chernobyl in 86. 89, the wall comes down. 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So as history is unfolding, I am also unfolding as a teenager. So that it always been in my brain, like I want to go there. I want to know what it's about, because it was always presented to me as my enemy. These are the people that want to kill me, my family, through nuclear annihilation. I mean, I was a little bit anxious ridden as a child. I probably still am, but so that's kind of like the background of why I ended up in Ukraine. But Ukraine was also a bit of an accident, because I started off in Russia and Moscow, but I found Moscow way too big, way too expensive, way too challenging. Everything was aggressive and confrontational. And I went to Kiev, and it was a heck of I don't know, this sort of warm bath waiting over me. I just felt very secure and friendly there. It was funny. They have a sense of humor. And it was just something that I immediately connected to. So there was something instinctual about me and the place that spoke. And that to me was kind of a sign to say, okay, let's figure it out. I mean, I don't know how to figure it out, but let's at least start.
So you went there and you started thinking about projects to do, or you had things in mind before going there, like on the story?
No, all I knew is I'm just going to go. I'll figure it out when I get there. And that's usually, I think it's generally sort of how I've always worked, is that I have an instinct about something, and then while I'm through the process, the story starts to unfold and shape itself. And I try to seize upon certain things and say, okay, well, maybe this is going to be a story. But I'll tell you, in Ukraine, after my first visit, which was 2004, 2005, I believe, at Christmas time, winter, New Year's, I was departing Kiev to come back to Canada. And I was at the airport, Borispol Airport, and I was walking across the street. And as I was walking across the street, I remember seeing out of the corner of my eye this big, like, black Mercedes, sort of like, you know, coming for me. But I think it's okay. I'm a pedestrian. I'm the vulnerable one here. I'm on the crosswalk. I'm walking. But anyways, he ended up sort of like nicking me. And I was stunned. You know, he took me out. I kind of stumbled, and he gets out of the car. He starts cursing at me. I start cursing back at him. And my friend who I just met, he said to me, "You can't talk to somebody like that. What are you doing?" I said, "Well, what is he doing? He can't talk. He can't like hit me. I'm just a simple guy with shoes, not in a big fancy car." So that was the first kind of moment that something clicked in my head, where there's a different sort of sensibility or value of life. And it really became this idea of power, that power is not necessarily achieved through currency, through money. Of course, that's a part of it, but it's really about having something that somebody else doesn't have and maintaining those unequal relationships. So that kind of stuck in my head, and I just started, you know, reading or doing research, watching films, etc., kind of trying to unfold this idea of the acquisition of power, basically. And that's just where I started.
Like the Interrogations project, this was like, it's also power, like someone like over, like they are in the interrogation room, and there is a certain power that I don't know if that's right, like from your interpretation. Is this during this series of power controlling, or?
Sure, yeah. I would say that Interrogations took me, okay, this is I started there in early, like January 1st, 2005 in Ukraine, and 2012, 7. It took me about 6 years, but it took me probably 4 years to figure out what exactly I needed to photograph. So I had traveled, at this time I was traveling all across Ukraine. I was traveling through Russia as well. There's 11 time zones in Russia. I've been to all of them except for one, basically. So I've been to the Far East, I've been to the North, I've been to the South, been to the West. And just kind of trying to figure out what it is that I'm looking at. And the interrogation came to me because, well, multiple reasons. I don't, again, know how much time we have for this, but essentially interrogations to me was a physical manifestation of power relations and inequality, dispossession, displacement. But also at the same time, this is about 2010, I guess, or so, where I started to feel a little bit queasy about photojournalism, about documentary photography, about photography, what it could do, why am I doing this, who am I to be here, how can I tell this, all of these kinds of complicated questions. So interrogations really is an interrogation, not just of inequality and dispossession and power, but also very much of the role of the photographer within these events as they unfold, the role of the witness, or even the role of you or I as spectators as we engage with imagery, the act of looking, the act of seeing. So it's all kind of, you know, messed up in there.
Whoa, and like I have how long do you spend per trip to Ukraine? Like you've been doing the interrogations project for 6 years, as you said. So how long was every single period? And like yeah, let's finish this question first, and then I'll ask you the other one.
Yeah, oh gosh. Well, I moved there in 2005. Yeah, again, data started to, yeah, actually, I got an apartment in Kiev, and I stayed in Kiev for a year, and then I moved to the east where most of this work was shot, and I lived there. So, but it was kind of off and on. I mean, it's not something that you can withstand that every day. But just kind of being there, for me, was very important, just to kind of live and breathe the air, suck it in, inhabit it, you know, make it a part of your life. For me, what I like about photography is that it is sort of an embodied experience, you know. When I was working on my other project, War Sand, it's on the coast. You know, the salt from the sea is in my hair, and the sun is on my face, and the sand is in my shoes, and you know, you're walking over mountains or like whatever, dunes and all this stuff. So I really like that, and for me to be in Ukraine, I had to just be there. Not to say that I'm going to know. That I'm not going, or that I'm going to figure it out. I mean, I always have to be self-aware that it's still me that's within this story, and I'm not here to say this is how it is, but this is how I see it, basically, or this is how I interpret it, or this is my sort of experience within this place. So, and that way I could work like 2 days, 1 day, but 3 months straight. So it varied.
And you worked this like without funding or something, like you were not sent by a newspaper or something to do it. It was pure passion, like you wanted to do this. You followed your instincts, right?
Yeah. I've always followed my instincts. By this time I had built some pretty good relationships, such as Newsweek magazine. So with Jamie Welford, for example, at Newsweek, Paul Moakley, who went to Time around that time. The Globe and Mail, my home newspaper, a few other smaller clients. And every now and then I would get some work. I mean, the idea was that I was more of let's say, a pitcher rather than a receiver. So I would always be pitching story ideas, at least enough to get me like a flight. Because if you're going to go to Siberia, it's expensive and you need some support. So I figured at least if I could get there, then I could continue the work that I wanted to do. So I was always pitching story ideas and such to various outlets, most of the time unsuccessfully, but every now and then it would strike. But then around 2007 or 6, I sort of discovered this whole thing called grants and funding. And I was quite successful in getting some grants. And that's also what afforded me to be in a cheap country. For me, it was very cheap to live. It gave me freedom. So I was suddenly unshackled from my obligations of being an assignment photographer. And now I could suddenly have semi-financial freedom, which gave me total 100% creative freedom. So I could do what I wanted when I wanted. But again, I mean, I spent just as much time producing applications for funds than I did photographing, easily, if not more. So
that takes a lot of time. It's very, very difficult, and you have to be patient, and you have to think a lot about a lot of stories. I mean, it's
it's a lot. Yeah. Even today, I still, I see things and I think, oh, well, oh, that could be an idea. That could be an idea. That could be an idea. But I also just got a little bit tired of doing, 5-day, 1 week, 1 day, 1 hour assignments. And I just wanted to figure out a way just to do the things that I wanted to do without any kind of professional obligations or the need to make something for somebody else. I kind of selfish, I guess, in that way. It's like, what can I do that I want to do?
Yeah. So someone asked, like, how did you get the access to the interrogations? Because this is as a foreign photographer, also out of the country, it's something very sensitive, I believe, and it's very difficult to go inside and witness this and be just like taking photos of something very violent and aggressive in front of you. So if, and you're like a fly on the wall, no one sees you, which is very, very, so let me know how did this happen?
Yeah, that took years of negotiation, basically, probably 4 or 5 years of knowing a policeman. So I guess you could say serendipitously, on my very first visit, I met this policeman. We're pretty much the same age, and he was sort of just starting out as an officer in the police force. I was just starting out as a photographer. So there was some kind of natural relationship, I guess, that was formed. He was very open. He was very proud of his job. He was very proud of how he conducted his job. And that to me was sort of eye-opening, because when I first started working there, I was slightly shocked by the methods of the police, and kind of angry about it, because it just was so foreign to me. And I remember speaking to my local friend then, and he said, who are you to judge? You're coming from Canada, where you have a just society. You've got functioning civil rights and human rights and democracy, blah, blah, all this stuff. He goes, who are you to talk about this? These cops are actually really good cops. They do the job that they were trained to do. They were trained improperly, and they were trained in shitty methods, bad methods. But, so that kind of really made me think about, well, am I documenting a Ukrainian interrogation room, or am I documenting the idea of, let's say, manipulation of power? And that to me was sort of a more interesting tactic or thing to sort of understand. So yeah, the negotiation just meant I was always close to the police officer. He always Googled me. Always. If he ever gave me any kind of access to anything, and if he would say, don't photograph this, it did happen a couple of times where I would photograph something, I don't know, I lost track, or I would post something, he would get really mad. He constantly Googled me. So I was very, very, very clear to never cross his, or to respect what he asked me to do. So it was just a relationship building trust, which took, as I said, a number of years. And then slowly over time, you just start to see things, you talk to them, you ask questions, who are you? And the other thing that he always asked me is but why? Why do you want to photograph this? And I could never answer it. I could never really give him a good answer, because I don't think I fully understood what it was that I needed to do. And then one day, I think it was maybe around 2009, he finally asked me, and I said, well, because of da-da-da-da-da. And he goes, okay, then you should say this 6 years ago. You know, we waste time. So it was that. But then that was just the first step. And then the second step, he said, okay, you can come into an interrogation room, but you have to ask all these people if you know, you've got to figure it out. I'll let you in, but beyond that, it's up to you. You need to negotiate. So I just would sit in the police station for hours and hours every day, sitting on a cold bench, and the people would be brought in, and I would try to speak to them. By then, my Russian was okay. I had a friend sometimes with me as well. So that then was the next step. And most people, of course, just said no. Other people said yes. And for whatever reasons they would say, I didn't necessarily get into that. But the other thing for me it took me also months to figure out was just, how am I going to photograph this? What am I going to do? Do I move around? And that's sort of why the images are so static, is because I understood that it had to just be a sort of a stationary point in time, basically. So no movement, no gesture, no nothing. And try to be in there as little as possible, basically. Yeah.
So, like, you did this as a book also, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Book came out in 2012.
Yeah. So I want to talk about books also. Like, that
Sure.
was your first book, or it was like you had previous books before? You have 4 books.
Yeah, I have 4 books. That, I would say that was my first book. I had a book before that from Chernobyl, just a very small, sort of thin publication. But what was nice about doing the Chernobyl book is that I got all the mistakes out. So I made all of my errors in that book. So by the time Interrogations, which was the second book, I kind of understood the bookmaking process. So I was lucky enough to be able to publish a small book in 2007 or 8, I forget. I think 2007 when that book came
So
out.
regarding books, like, what's harder, like getting started, doing the first book, or keep going, be able to keep going and doing more books?
Well, I think what's nice about publishing a book is that it becomes something that you like. I like the finality of a book. It's literally between bookends. And the book itself is also a very interesting form, because it's not a film, but it's not a novel. It's sort of in this interstitial space, and the idea of movement, you know, flipping through pages. Like when I'm thinking, when I'm working, when I'm out shooting, I always just imagine a sequence. I can sort of envision a photograph in a page and me flipping through it. And that notion of flipping, I really, really, really sort of like. So for me, books, I like the act of making a book. And I guess I'm just not very imaginative or clever, so I really only find books as the kind of only medium. I've never really been interested in exhibition or installations. I've never really been interested in, I don't know, new media techniques and such. I guess I'm kind of old school in the sense that I just like this thing that exists between the pages. But I never really set out to make a book. It just so happens that about halfway through, because I'm sort of thinking in such a way with the flipping of the pages, that it starts to become a book. So the other thing about books is that they have complexity in it, and that you can give a lot of responsibility to the viewer. That there's a lot of things that I can set up and I can address, but I can push it outwards to the audience, and that they also get to engage with what it is that I choose to share with them. So their journey also gets discovered on their own, outside of me. And I really like that notion that everybody who goes through my book reconstructs a different story. So that's, for me, why I like to do books. Making a book like War Sand was altogether a 5-year project, but 3 years just working on the book, as where Interrogations actually was very quick in terms of the publication. When I was lucky enough to work with a Dutch designer named Teun van der Heijden. I don't know if you met him or not, Ahmed, but we did that, I don't remember, but very quickly. Within weeks, that thing was figured out. And that's partly because I kind of understood the conceptual idea behind the project. I was able to communicate it to him. I always make little dummies and such. And then he sort of translated the conceptual thought that I had into some kind of graphic form. And I really liked that relationship where somebody else then takes my my flat images and turns it into some kind of form, experience, I guess, in a way.
So how does this thing goes? Like how can a photographer like who has a solid work can do a book like?
Yeah, man, today it's so difficult. I have to say. I think there are so many publishers and such out there that demand payment. You know, probably 20,000 euros, probably on average, 15 to 25,000 euros to publish
what?
to
To
publish
publish
a book.
a book?
Yeah, yeah,
Whoa.
yeah, yeah. So what that gets you would be design. That's the printing costs, the distribution, blah, blah, all this kind of stuff. And I mean, it's really expensive to publish a book, and it's very difficult to publish a book. And there's a lot of different sort of networks that you need in order to have a book survive. So when I did Interrogations, I was lucky enough probably to be one of the last photographers that was still in the kind of, let's say, the old way of publishing, where a publisher would actually, you know, they would pay you to make the book. And Interrogations would show surprise.
That's what the thing I thought that it would normally happen that like you get paid to do a book or find a publisher even not getting paid, but you don't pay for doing a book. This is and okay.
Well, that's kind of the unhidden secret out there. So, I mean, there are publishers out there that will take the financial risk, but generally, the majority of photo book publishers are expecting some kind of financial commitment from you, the photographer.
Okay.
It doesn't really get discussed out there in the real world. So that's also why I ended up self-publishing, because I was sort of curious. You know, I was lucky enough to have a bit of a following. Some people like what I do, so I knew that I could reach out to them and I could distribute the book directly. But man, is it really, it's super tough out there. So what I did with Interrogations, it was 2011 maybe. I went to Arles because I was in Europe at the time. So for me, it was fairly easy to get there. There was a couple of people that I knew. There was this Dutch producer, curator who I'd bumped into. I had made a dummy. I had actually spent, I spent about 2,000 euros hiring a friend of mine who I really liked as a designer, just to help me construct a dummy that was convincing, but not so convincing that the publisher would say, but what do I actually offer? So kind of trying to strike that balance. And she really liked this publication, and she immediately dragged me over to Martin, the publisher of Schild Publishing, and said, you should publish this book. And he looked at it and he said, yeah, all right. I was like, oh, this is easy. This is not so difficult after all. So I was quite lucky in that sense. But then the next book was much more difficult to sort of find somebody to publish. And I would just, kind of always have my dummy with me. You never know, like show people, talk about it. Maybe, you should show this person, or I can introduce you to that person, that kind of thing.
Do you recommend self-publishing? Was it something successful from your point of view?
I guess, what's your definition of successful?
Successful is like reaching out to people, selling, actually, like...
I made my money back. Yeah, I made my money back, and I might have even, heaven forbid, made a profit, but not much. But Warsan was a pretty expensive book, but I get into that in a second. But yeah, I'm of two minds of self-publishing. So the reason I wanted to do it was A, to see if I could do it, to see if it would be worth maybe trying to figure out like a small model for small publishers. But one thing that I've started to kind of get slightly disappointed in with photo books and such is that you know, the print run of a photo book is 500, 750, 1,000 copies. Maybe if it's a sort of higher end, or I don't know, a bigger publisher, you might get a couple of thousand. But on average, if you go to those book fairs or the photo festivals, it's 500, 800 copies. And for what? We, each of us, are buying the books. So it's sort of like, you know, a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. Like, we're buying each other's books, but who is actually buying my book that I want to? So with War Sand, I thought, okay, this can be a way that I can attempt to at least dip into an audience that I'm interested in. Not necessarily say I'm not interested in photographers, because I knew that that would be a significant part of, yes, circulating between us, says Rohan Nemo, exactly. So I wanted to get outside of that loop of circulation. And I figured the only way I could do that is control the distribution myself. And so one thing that I did with War Sand is that I got it into libraries. That to me was a very important thing. So I printed 1,000 copies. It's not a very big book, but I mean, it's a big book, but it's not a big print run. But out of those 1,000 copies, there's, I think, 500 and something in public libraries in Canada and the United States. You know, university libraries and, you know, civic libraries and such. So to me, that was the only way I could do that, was to control how the circulation actually can function. And the other thing with self-publishing is you need to have some kind of audience. So you need to figure out what your audience is. And one thing I've noticed here, the Dutch photographers can be quite clever in terms of finding ways to develop an audience. So they're very keen on asking themselves, who do I want to engage with this project? It's not just a photo book, but who am I speaking to? What is it that I want to communicate? How is it that I can get there? So what they do is they then say partner with certain institutions, organizations, community groups, etc., that aren't necessarily interested in photography as like an art historical form, but are interested in the story that it is that you're sharing or that you're telling, so that they might buy 200 copies, 300 copies beforehand. And that's pretty much enough to fund a print run of 800, 1,000 copies. So now you've already built yourself an audience, and then the next part is then to sort of develop that audience even a little bit more.
Okay, so I want to go back to stories again. Like, how do you know when your story is finished? Like, when do you walk away?
Well, I can tell you, when I was in Ukraine, I woke up one morning and I had this sort of vision in my head of a little Post-it note on the night table beside me, and it said, "It's time to go home now." I mean, it didn't literally say that, but I had that. I knew it, and I got up and I left Ukraine for years at that moment, because I think there I was so frustrated, and I probably went down much too deep, much too dark of a world to inhabit, that I needed to leave. And I would say with War Sand, yeah, I remember distinctly in War Sand, it was maybe my 6th trip to Normandy in France, photographing along the beaches. And each trip I used to do about 2 weeks, a 2 weeks, maybe 3-week photographic trip. And within about 5-6 days of that last photographic trip, I was looking and I just couldn't see anything anymore. And I stopped. And normally when I'm working, I'm pretty much like sunrise to sunset, and I forget to eat. People who work with me don't like to work with me because I forget to eat and that kind of thing. And I said, oh, I'm hungry. I'm going to go get some French fries. And I went to a cafe on the beach, and I sat there for 3 hours, and I had no thought. I couldn't see anything anymore. My eyes were like, they were done. And I knew that's it. The project's done. At least this part of the project is done. Of course, there's the whole design of the publication and working on the book and assembling all that stuff. But the sort of the core of the project was finished. So just I couldn't see, which is kind of the opposite when I know my favorite part of working on a project is the moment when you actually start to see what you need to photograph, and everything else sort of drifts away. So when you're walking down the street or you're walking along the beach or whatever it is, I know what I need to photograph and I can see it. It just sort of like, it becomes an image in front of me, and I know how I want to approach it and I know what to do. But with Warsan, it was dead to me. I was like, there's no more photographs left. So the next step is to take stock of all of the photographs that I've made. What do I have to confront it and to reflect upon it?
That's very interesting. Like, yeah, it happens like sometimes, but sometimes isn't it just like fake alert or something? Like your art blocked and you're like, you can't see any more, and then suddenly you just take a step back and then you start seeing again? Or for you it happens in a different way? Like,
Yeah. Well, that's why when I work, I like to go and then leave. So I'm always sort of coming and going. Because
okay.
when I leave, I get distance from whatever it is I'm working on. But I always know, oh, when I come back, I remember this distinctly with Warsan as well. I was like, when I come back, I'm only going to photograph clouds for my first week. I don't care about anything else. I'm just going to point my camera up to the clouds and I'm only going to photograph clouds. And to me, that was great, where I really understood what I needed to do. So then I went home, I look at my cloud photographs and I'm like, okay, you got great clouds, but you know what? You're also missing this, and this. So that would then set me up for the next trip. So for me, I need to have the intense periods of production and intense periods of unproduction. But I also know if I can't see anymore, you can't force it.
Yes.
Like, for me, it's very difficult to just, and that's I think also why I was a terrible assignment photographer, because I needed to,
You need
yeah, and like you have to produce no matter what. And I'm kind of somewhat lazy and somewhat of a, what's the word, procrastinator.
So was the transition to documentary photography easier than architecture photography? Like you're from an architecture background, so
Yeah.
easier to go to zone.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a good question. I never really thought about that before. Maybe the one difference would be, in architecture, there's a whole infrastructure and network and protocol. You just do, and it exists, and there's millions and millions and billions of dollars that flying around, and all kinds of things. And I find photography, for some bizarre reason, is still kind of in this incubatory phase where they insist on the kind of heroic sense of the individual author, this sort of, that genius kind of thing, which doesn't necessarily translate well into, I don't know how to say this. I mean, like, it's just like a weird infrastructure that doesn't necessarily support the very precarious and vulnerable worlds of photography.
Okay. So you don't.
To be a photographer, you're sort of, to be a photographer, you're like perpetually forced to be living in a very, this is when I start to sound negative of photography, but like kind of, in a very precarious position. And it's fostered to be precarious. And the sort of precarity within photography I've always been slightly puzzled about. But there's also kind of an insistence, a sort of set of very determined protocols of photography that it is like this. You do it in such and such a way that there's not much. And if you deviate from that, it's very difficult to sort of, I think, withstand or to exist within that.
I think like you don't like to be like handcuffed or something, or like you have to do it this way. You like to experience, and like all of your projects, they are totally like they have a certain style, but at the same time you experience new things and new ways of seeing. Like I remember when I had the workshop with you in 2012, I think, and
Yeah.
it was a very, very hard time in Egypt, and on me also, it was very tough. And you were like, that's the good thing, use it. I was like, how come can I use negative negative stuff? And like, I'm so frustrated and so sad. I was like, you were so happy that this was happening, and and you were like, use this negative energy into something, put it in something. I always remember this advice, and it helped me a lot. Like I never thought about shifting something like this into something inspiring. Like how did you achieve this way of thinking? Like what happened to you personally that made
Oh.
you think that way? Like
Yeah, good question. I think, well, I believe that in the kind of creative process, there's inherent to struggle. And I don't mean struggle in the sense that I have to live in a garret by myself and freeze, but I believe that roadblocks and obstructions and obstacles are actually quite beneficial to, like, how do you choose to navigate the roadblock that you're confronted with? And it's not just about art or photography, but I also think that's sort of inherent to life as well. That I guess, okay, the cliche, what is it? When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. It's kind of lame. I apologize for that. But I do believe that the sort of strengths in my own work is because I've had to sort of be confronted or challenged by something, and to sort of meet that challenge head on in some kind of way is always, you know, there's kind of like that sense of friction or yeah, friction, you know, when something rubs up against something else, that tension in there, I kind of enjoy that space, because
interesting.
like the how do I navigate something basically? And I'm reminded of course, I show it to my students, so the Five Obstructions by Lars von Trier. I would highly recommend everybody go watch that film, because it's all about what do you do when you're confronted with an obstruction. And what's nice about that film is
the five.
It's called the Five Obstructions by Lars von Trier. It's a documentary. It's sort of a sadistic documentary, but it's fantastic because he confronts a friend of his who's a filmmaker, who he says made the greatest film of all time, and now he asks him with certain obstructions to remake that film again, because von Trier insists that artistic genius is sort of this thing that is inherent to the person, that it doesn't actually in other words, it's not like some lightning bolt out of the sky, but that you work for it and you earn it. And in this film, he talks about that. That's basically what the film then is about, is sort of always being challenged. And every challenge that the filmmaker would come up against, in fact, he made an even better outcome than the original film itself. So it's great. And I think I live by that philosophy as well.
So I want also to ask something, like, don't you feel at some points that you're, like, as you said earlier, that you ask yourself, like, am I a photographer? What am I doing here? Like, you always ask yourself those questions, right? Or this happened, and still now, like, even after all those years of photography?
Oh yeah, that's why I'm doing a PhD, because I'm still trying to figure it out. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. In a total existential quagmire, I guess, as I find myself in a perpetual. Yeah, of course. I think then I would just get bored. I mean, if I'm not going to sort of challenge myself or elevate myself into some kind of unknown realm, then to me that's not very interesting. I've never really wanted to perpetuate. I mean, I like kind of getting good at something. I like the idea that I feel really comfortable in photography. I feel comfortable in the fact that I kind of know what I'm talking about, but in the same sense, not that I want to destroy it, but I want to expand it. And the only way to expand that is to, I think, confront yourself and challenge yourself and perpetually ask these confrontational questions, I guess, of what is it that I'm doing? Why is it that I'm doing it? Why should this exist? Because I do believe, you know, photography, there's such a great responsibility that you have as a photographer. I mean, well, we don't even go into all these questions of representation and such, but there's such I think, a weight that comes with it that you have to be asking yourself perpetually ask these questions to yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, and you find it normal that just to be doubting yourself all the time, because sometimes like you feel like you're totally no, I don't want to say depressed, but feeling down and feeling pressured, and so it takes a lot of time. Sometimes you have this art block. Like what exercises do you do personally in order to get this art block away, rather than leaving? Like you said that you leave. What else do you do to have this to like answer all the questions and go back to work and do something? What do you do?
Yeah, well, for me, the big thing is I'm lazy. And because I'm lazy, then it means I don't do stuff. No, for me, it's important. I like my summers. I love the summer. I don't want to necessarily be doing much in the summer. So I'm perpetually kind of pondering and thinking, which at times is really taxing on me. It makes me exhausted, but in the same sense, I'm also really good at just going, no, that's fine. I don't need to do that. So there's these kind of like bursts of activity and bursts of nothing.
Do you feel any regrets, like having time for yourself and not like working on a certain project that you thought you were like, oh, you feel that you will put something on? Like, how do you balance this?
Well, I'm in my 40s, and when you're in your 40s, the greatest gift you get is to hell with everything else. I don't really care, to be honest. When I was in my 30s, sure. I mean, I wanted to have certain, you know, I wanted to have the certain plaques and such, you know, the kind of accolades and the protocols in the art world and the photography world bestowed upon me. But ever since I turned 40, and I'm now 46, soon to be 47, it's just like, I really honestly just do what I want to do without having the consequences of prestige or accolades rained down upon me, because I actually think one of the worst things that sort of happens within an art world and a photography world is that it is so structured, rigorously structured by prizes, awards, etc., all of these kinds of things. So we start making work not for because we are close to it, because it represents who I am. It's something that I'm close to. I want to know more about. I want to share it with somebody else. But we do it because that's what we have to do. And I certainly also chased that for years. But I'd say in the last 8-10 years, I've started to realize I just kind of need to do the thing that I want to do. And so I'm very slow with that as well. So I do one thing and it takes me 5 years and I'm okay with that. And if only a bunch of libraries, university libraries in North America and Europe look at my thing, well, I'm also fine with that. I'm okay.
Whoa. So
and that actually releases a sense of freedom.
Really? You felt the sense of freedom? You don't feel the pressure anymore?
No, I can't say it's completely gone, because every now and then, of course, I'm still human, and I was disciplined in art school 25 years ago, and in art school this is what you're told to do, and I teach in a university now, and of course there's certain ways of doing. Maybe to paraphrase John Berger, there are certain ways of seeing, right? But in the same sense, I'm getting better at releasing myself from giving a care of what others, certainly what the industry says I need to do or how I do it. And I'm very happy with not doing what I should be doing, I guess, but doing the thing that I would like to do.
Well,
I don't know how else to explain that, but
that's clear.
yeah, I think I love being in my 40s. If I could just live 80 years of my life but be perpetually 42, I think it'd be a wonderful thing. Because you know, you're old enough to have experienced everything a few times. You're getting pretty good at something, so you feel confident in something. But you're also starting to age, where the experiences also mean, it doesn't. Yeah, it's okay. That doesn't necessarily mean something anymore, or whatever. You know, so you're kind of in a way your world shrinks, but it also becomes very big and grand. And there's a balance between that universe. So I like it.
That's inspiring. Oh,
How
yes.
old are you? You're like what, 33?
Exactly. How come you did this? I don't know, but it's 33 years.
My secret skill.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember this. Like during our workshop, you had this. You know how to age people. It's very weird. Like I don't know how, but you get it right. So
It's the photographer's skill of looking at faces intensely.
oh yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you also, like regarding like that you do what you want to do. Like this is something very interesting and very big, because in like in my 30s, let's talk about myself or my age. Like all photographers at this age, you normally look at social media, and social media is something big now, and everyone is like comparing like subconsciously with other photographers from all over the world, and here and there and there, and it's very pressuring. It's very competitive. Technology is getting more and more and more like powerful and strong. Like how come like you're not really into Instagram or Facebook? You don't really care. I think so. Like yeah,
No.
how did you
No, in
reach this?
fact, my Instagram account is deplorable. I used to have, I must be the only Instagram account holder that loses followers quicker than I gain. So I used to have 40,000 followers. No, not by, I didn't do anything, it just sort of suddenly appeared within a few months. But it steadily decreases. And for a while there, I actually quite enjoyed Instagram. Like I used to like, whenever I would travel, I would just sort of like walk around the place I was in with my phone to try to make a really nice iPhone image for Instagram, like a photograph. I really wanted to make a really nice, cool photograph that I could post to my account. And I did that for a while, but then I also realized like, well, it's so much work, and there's a lot of and I get it, you know, like there's so many photographers around. There's so many people who would like to be doing this professionally, like making a living at it. I want to make a living at it, etc. And the pressure upon all photographers to sort of constantly perform to me is the most sort of terrifying aspect of what it means to be a photographer today. And I sort of completely empathize with my students who are entering in this world where they not only do they have to perform, but they also have to produce. And I think those two things are really sort of dangerous for the health of anybody. Then we just become just another widget in the massive machine of capital to make us turn out something. And I believe there's got to be some way that we can resist that. So I still use my Instagram sometimes, but I've been posting pictures of my view and from my apartment, and I get, you know, I don't know, 60 likes or something. And I kind of just give up because I don't know. It's just, I don't really care anymore. And I remember the day that I just stopped Facebook. I sort of did it cold turkey because I used to be on there quite a lot. But I just got fed up with it because I realized we're just sort of shouting at each other. There's nothing that's necessarily being communicated that I could take with me, that I want to sort of know, that I want to sort of learn. And I deleted it from my phone. I turned off all the notifications and such. And great, I don't miss it at all.
at all. I don't care anymore. And yes, I used to make a little bit of money from more from Instagram than Facebook. Instagram, because I would post something and I would always give a location. So somebody would say, "Oh, are you in such and such a place?" Then, you know, maybe something is happening. Or I used to like to share my project in progress. I thought that was kind of fun. I like to just sort of say, "Oh, here's what I'm working on. What do you think?" And then after a while, I realized that I just don't care all that much to make it a brand, I guess. I just am not a brand. I don't care. I just have a very small world, and I have a couple of things that I want to do, and that's about it. And yeah, I'm okay with that. Of course, sometimes I think, you know, I don't know, maybe if I go to Aro one year, I look at the big, beautiful exhibition, I think, my God, I would love to have my work in such an environment. But I'm also, again, as I said, I'd much rather be in my parents' place in New Hampshire in the summertime, sitting on the swing, than going out there kind of, you know, hammering the pavement to make some of this stuff happen. But the thing I'm at right now is also trying to see where else can we have our work as photographers. And that's partly what I would like to do with my PhD is, why is it that I only have to speak to you? Why can't I speak to others? And that was something for me in Warsand, where it started to happen. I don't necessarily say it was well done to some degree in terms of who I wanted to acknowledge and who I wanted to reach. So in the same way, that's sort of where I'm at right now, is going elsewhere. And to me, maybe it was a year ago or a year and a half ago, somebody said to me, "Don, are you upset because Warsand is," I forget what they said, something like Warsand was a failure or something like that. Is it a failure? What do you mean? Well, it didn't win the prizes and it wasn't nominated for the whatever book prize, our book prize, Barry Photo, all these kinds of things. I said, I don't know, because I didn't even bother with this. I didn't even bother to enter it into very many things. Very, very few things did I choose to enter it. I was more focused on, again, sort of reaching the this library space. To really kind of try to move beyond photography.
I have a question for you. Like, how do you define success from your point of view?
If I can do whatever I want. No, that's a little, no. I want to be creatively satisfied.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to be creatively satisfied. I want to feel proud of something. Yeah, I want to feel proud of what I did. Like, you know, every now and then, just the other day, actually, I had to take out a copy of Warsand because I was sending it to somebody. And I hadn't really looked through it in a few months, and I was flipping through it, and I was looking at it, and I thought, wow, this is pretty nice. This is a pretty good book. Who made this? I'm like, I made this. I can't believe I did this. And so I was sort of proud of that I was able to sort of start from a grain of sand and to sort of expand it into something so whatever, that was mine. And people responded to it. And so that to me was really proud. And that's what I look for with the next project, is what can I be proud of? What do I want to sort of leave behind, I guess? Not in terms of a legacy, but, you know, what is this? And as I see somebody says here, success is being in Bonaire. Exactly. I was in the Caribbean last year. And to be honest, if I could have 25 degrees every day in blue sky, wearing flip-flops and shorts and a t-shirt and walking about and doing some reading and taking the odd photograph and then doing my project a couple of months of the year, I would be more than ecstatic to just have that. I'd be really happy with that. Because I think, like, to have sort of like creative autonomy to me is really important.
Okay, that's I should learn from this, and I should slow down a bit. And yeah. So lately, like with all this pressure and everything, like you go into this cycle with life, and you just don't think anymore, and you just keep going from one assignment to another. And I believe you did this in your early years also. But yeah, you need time for yourself. You need to just slow down and see what you're doing and why are you doing this. Like, thank you for all this information and for the wake-up call. That is very, very important. So Farah is like asking you something. With all the world moving to the virtual world, do you think the occupation of the photographer will manifest to something else?
Oh, so the question is about going to the virtual world and how will photography or photographers be in that world, I guess? Is that sort of the question?
Yes.
Oh, that's a good question. To be honest, I haven't had too much time to think about it, only because my time in quarantine under COVID-19 lockdown has been pretty much perpetually behind a computer dealing with the university, the academy that I work at. And to be honest, I have not able, like, I can only see a couple of days in advance. And this is, to me, it's slightly troubling because this is the first time where I've really only been able to see like now, like this. I'm so blinkered and it's kind of shocking to me. So I haven't really been able to kind of look ahead or look forward or even have time to think about it. But you know, yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of two minds. I know a lot of people are putting exhibitions online, you know, through VR, different apps and such like that. And I like the fact that there's sort of the sense of the commons that the virtual world can give you. There's a sort of inherent socialism, I guess, but in the same sense, it's still exclusive. It's still an exclusive territory because you need the sort of software, you need the bandwidth, you need the access. And to me, that's always the biggest barrier with photography is the fact that it's a perpetual question of who has access and who doesn't. Either from us, the photographers, the people that we engage with, and also the audiences and how they also can have access. So, yeah, I don't know, but I do have hope for I love photography. I absolutely love photography, and I want to die making photographs. Every now and then, when I actually go out into the world with my camera, I was just working on something about 6-7 weeks ago, shooting in the port of Rotterdam, and I just remembered it was cold and it was snowing and it was wet, and there was like trucks going by, all this kind of stuff, and I just thought, oh, I really love this. Being a photographer because I'm literally like I'm in the world, I'm there, and I like that. I don't know if that really answers the question about the virtual part of photography, but.
And there's another question also, which is very interesting. Like, how do you see photography industry evolving after the end of the pandemic, from your point of view?
Hopefully we can get rid of the word industry because I think that's part of the problem is that. Okay. Oh man, yeah, that's a difficult question too. But I guess it's funny as I get older. I think I'm becoming a bit of a Marxist or a bit of a neo-Marxist, where everything I see is sort of related to commerce and to capital, and that everything photography, of course, is a child of capital, right? It's a commodity. So to say it can't be an industry, then who am I to say that? But in the same sense, the kind of I guess again, it goes back to the question of the protocols. Like you're obligated to work in such a way if you want to be known. And I always find it very strange that in order to be a successful photographer, you have to be a known photographer. Like you have to have certain criteria behind you, certain prizes, affiliations, exhibitions, et cetera, But I'm also starting to wonder, but what else? What are the other sort of fields that you can enter as a photographer that aren't necessarily defined by a rigid set of protocols within a discipline? Like, can we undiscipline ourselves? I'm not sure. I think we can.
Yeah, you have an answer for this? Can we?
We try. I mean, not to plug the academy I'm teaching at, but part of the idea behind the master's program at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague is we call it undisciplining and unlearning something. So undisciplining means sort of crossing paths with other trajectories, being not just multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, but extradisciplinary. And extradisciplinary means you involve as much as you can from outside, from other disciplines, amateur and professional, but also you work from within, say, the institution that you're at. So it's not a complete renouncing, but it's more of a question of, say, like the way that I could sort of look at it, because one thing I'm looking at a lot lately is logistics. And there's a thing in logistics called a choke point. And a choke point is the moment, the most sort of vulnerable part of a supply chain. And so the vulnerable part of the supply chain, if you go on strike there, you can sort of shut down a certain part of the supply chain, right? So there's an idea that some labor activists have, is that we will go to the choke points and we will sort of stop working, like longshoremen in the harbors or security officers, etc. But the idea with that, though, is that the corporation is always going to be much bigger than you, and it's going to be more nimbler than you, it's going to have more resources than you, so it will just pivot to something else. So all you're doing is sort of aggravating something. But the other idea is, but in what way can you sort of use, say, the language or the discipline of something like logistics or like photography in order to create a collective solidarity, not just within your own group, but say globally, between what I can do here and what you can do in Egypt, in Cairo. I'm not quite sure what that means yet. I'm just sort of something percolating in my brain, but I do like that idea that perhaps if this notion of industry slightly gets dismantled, so we start thinking on an amateur basis, and amateur means I do it because I love it. And I'm actually pretty good at it because I am the amateur. And I like that sort of affiliation or that idea. I haven't quite been able to articulate it yet, but at least that's where I'm headed. So maybe for me, I become an amateur, and I like that.
I have also a question regarding this, like, because it's very, very challenging, like, especially when you do commercial work, like, you do things for clients and you do things for, for money also, like, you need to do this and you have to be in the industry, like the word that you don't like, but it's actually, unfortunately, it's a fact. So, how to do things your own way and also be in, you know? This is very, very difficult and hard to do. I
still struggle with that because I'm in an institution. I run a program in an institution. So I understand that conflict, and I think it can only really come back to your own sort of small circle that you situate your feet upon, the little tile of grass that you call yours. And that's just to be able to make, I think if you can make the one thing that is yours, that you feel close to, that you're committed to, that you've challenged yourself, etc., like, then I think that's it. That's what you need. You can still work commercially, etc., but you always need to sort of find the moment of release where your own body and soul is committed to the one thing that you can do at this time. Yeah,
that's true. I mean, okay, continue. No, sorry. No. I have one last question. Like, actually, it's two parts. Like, what's the one mistake most photographers or storytellers make, regardless of experience?
Gosh, I don't know if there can be one. Oh man, I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that question.
You can name more than one. Don't worry.
I'm just okay. Let me think. Well, there's a question of ambition, which I like, because I think in my own personal work, the work that I do, I mean, there's an ambition in there, but ambition can also be seen as a naughty word. You know, I'm sort of allergic to ambition, but I'm also very ambitious myself. And so I think to understand the sort of fine line between being ambitious for the work that you want to make, but having a sort of personal sense of ambition that sort of overwhelms everything is always a bit of a problem, I guess. And it's not necessarily about age or anything, or even experience. I think it's more of a question of, I don't know, character, I guess. But also sometimes what happens, certainly in young photographers, like when they're ambitious with certain works, it's very difficult to kind of get a sense of what it is that you're making. So the complexity overwhelms the very simple atomic level of the story that you want to tell. So for me, I'm always sort of interested in like, what's the grain of sand that you want to look at? Everything can be complex, but you have to be able to sort of find the essence, the core of something. What is the nugget or the subatomic particle that exists within that work? And so I especially find today a lot of work is becoming complex, and I like complex stories myself and epics and such. But I do find the complexity is becoming an affect rather than emerging out of the process itself. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but.
That's very interesting. I have one last question. Continue.
I was just going to say, because it's complex doesn't make it interesting. I mean, I think back to Kras Clemens, the Danish photographer, that project called The Drum, or just a man in a bar. I mean, it's a simple story, yet it's incredibly complex in terms of the social relations that project unfolds. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about now.
Okay. So I have one last question.
Yes.
What advice do you give, like, for your students and for the people listening, as like going into photography and pursuing their photography career? What's your like secret formula that you can give for people in the photography field?
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough one because, well, what I've learned over the last 5 years of teaching at the university is I'm always amazed at the students who come in who just have like an inherent sensibility and they're great right out, boom, they're explosive. And I've always wondered where that comes from. But then I'm also super interested in the photographer that's maybe a little bit quieter, that doesn't necessarily fully comprehend who they are, what they do, how they do it, etc. But just a sort of like steadiness and a commitment to sort of really learning and being curious and perpetually confronting themselves to curiosity. Those are the ones upon graduation that usually end up, to me, becoming very interesting photographers, because I mean, maybe it's sort of going back to my neo-Marxist mentality, but I kind of sometimes would like to see photography as a function of labor. There's a sort of working class nature to it, that you wake up, you go out and you make things and you make photographs, etc. So there's kind of like that labor intensity to it, which means it's a job and you work at it and you make things happen, as opposed to this sort of artistic genius that gets struck in the head. And there are artistic geniuses out there, of course, right? But generally, most of us have to just kind of do it, and to be active and rigorous in developing a system for yourself of doing it. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of corny, but that's what I would say, is just sit down and crack on. And but it also means being rigorous in developing a way of working, I think, as well. So that means, it doesn't mean, okay, in exactly 3 weeks' time, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that. Like for me, I've just been, like I guess I'm a systems thinker in a way. So I understand the kind of, I need to set my base level, my structure down. And it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of years to sort of develop that. And once you kind of have a working methodology, basically, then I believe the work can kind of unfold and become something. But also to be your own biggest fan, I guess, like be committed to who you are and what you do and have belief in it. Because I do believe, oh man, I'm speaking in real cliches tonight. I'm sorry, but I do believe by doing it, it actually happens. Kevin Costner, Field of Dreams, right? If you build it, they will come. I completely subscribe to that philosophy. It might take 50 years, but eventually it's going to come around. And that also means trying your best to stay away from the pageantry of the industry.
Yeah. It's
not a Miss America contest.
That's very inspiring, and it has to be like put here and go back to all these words every now and then. Thank you so much, Don, for this very, very, very inspiring talk. Like I miss this so much. It's been a long time.
It has.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your time, for all your valuable information and thoughts. It's always very inspiring to listen to what you think about and how you switch things and turn them totally the opposite. It's so much fun to see this.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who's watching us. And sorry for the cut off with the internet, but we're back here. And if anyone missed the first live, it's on for 24 hours on Beit El Sura. We do lives every Saturday, Tuesday, and Thursday from 11 p.m. Egyptian time. We'll be doing a lot of lives like with photographers and filmmakers from around the world. Thank you so much, Don. It's been a pleasure having you, and wishing you a very inspiring lockdown. Hope it ends. Hope it ends soon, and you'll be back to like continue doing more very inspiring and effective work soon, inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Nice to see you again, Ahmed. Thanks for having me.
Have a great night. Bye-bye.
All right, you too. Bye.